Hello and welcome to Talking Tolkien. In this, chapter 4 of our tale of Frodo's journey, we'll be heading out of the desolate Lonelands and into the Trollshaws. At the end of chapter 3, we left Frodo on Weathertop after getting stabbed by a ringwraith in the middle of the night. Frodo regained consciousness, though wounded, and Strider disappeared until dawn, when he returned with the Athelas herb, which he used to bathe Frodo's shoulder, lessening the pain and frozen cold felt in the injured hobbit's wounded side. As soon as the daylight was full, they had some hurried food and packed. It was impossible for Frodo to walk, so they divided the greater part of their baggage among the four of them, and put Frodo on the pony. They started off in a southerly direction. This would mean crossing the road, but it was the quickest way to more wooded country, and they needed fuel, for Strider said that Frodo must be kept warm, especially at night, while fire would be some protection for them all. It was also his plan to shorten their journey by cutting across another great loop of the road. East beyond Weathertop it changed its course and took a wide bend northwards. They made their way slowly and cautiously round the southwestern slopes of the hill, and came in a little while to the edge of the road. There was no sign of the riders, but even as they were hurrying across, they heard far away two cries, a cold voice calling and a cold voice answering. Trembling, they sprang forward and made for the thickets that lay ahead. The land before them sloped away southwards, but it was wild and pathless. Bushes and stunted trees grew in dense patches, with wide barren spaces in between. The grass was scanty, coarse and grey, and the leaves in their thickets were faded and falling. It was a cheerless land, and their journey was slow and gloomy. The hobbits spent the next few days traipsing over this bleak landscape, so we will do the same. To pass the time, here is Tolkien himself telling the tale that Aragorn told the hobbits on Weathertop, the tale of Tinuviel.
The leaves were long, the grass was green, the hemlock umbels dull and fair, and in the glade a light was seen of stars in shadow shimmering. Tinuviel was dancing there to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair and in her raiment glimmering. There Beren came from mountains cold, and lost he wandered under leaves, and where the elven river rolled he walked alone and sorrowing. He peered between the hemlock leaves, and saw in wonder flowers of gold upon her mantle and her sleeves, and her hair like shadow following. Enchantment healed his weary feet that over hills were doomed to roam, and forth he hastened, strong and fleet, and grasped at moonbeams glistening. Through woven woods and elven homes she lightly fled on dancing feet, and left him lonely still to roam the silent forest listening. He heard thereof the flying sound of feet as light as linden leaves, or music welling underground in hidden hollows quavering. Now withered lay the hemlock sheaves, and one by one with sighing sound, whispering fell the beechen leaves in the wintry woodland wavering. He sought her ever wandering far, where leaves of years were thickly strewn, by light of moon and ray of star in frosty heavens shivering. Her mantle glinted in the moon, as on a hilltop high and far she danced, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quivering. When winter passed she came again, and her song released the sudden spring, like rising lark and falling rain and melting water bubbling. He saw the elven flowers spring about her feet and healed again. He longed by her to dance and sing on the grass untroubling. Again she fled, but swift he came. Tinuviel, Tinuviel, he called her by her elvish name. and there she halted, listening. One moment stood she, and a spell his voice laid on her. Beren came, and doom fell on Tinuviel, that in his arms lay glistening. As Beren looked into her eyes, within the shadow of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies he saw there mirrored shimmering. Tinuviel the elven fair, immortal maiden, elven wise, about him cast her shadowy hair, and arms like silver glimmering. Long was the way that fate them bore o'er stony mountains golden grey, through halls of iron and darkling door, and woods of nightshade morrowless. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more. And long ago they passed away in the forest, singing sorrowless.
After an uneventful 6 days, the group reached the eastern edge of the Lonelands and camped southwest of the last bridge, which was the only crossing of the river Horwell, which the elves call Mithathiel. Then we get to my favourite part, where we get to look at a map of our progress across the region. The yellow and red lines up to Weathertop are from the previous day's travelling, covered in Chapter 3, and the blue line represents Frodo's journey over the next 6 days, up to the evening of 12th of October. I normally break this down into a distance per day, but as the description given by Tolkien is quite vague at this point in the journey, it's not practical to do that in this case. Next day, early in the morning, they came down again to the borders of the road. Sam and Strider went forward, but they found no sign of any travellers or riders. They hurried along with all the speed they could make, and after a mile or two they saw the last bridge ahead, at the bottom of a short, steep slope. It was here that Strider scouted on ahead to make sure there were no black riders around the last bridge, and when he came back, he'd got a single pale green jewel, which was a beryl, an elfstone, which he'd found at the bridge. They still weren't sure what it meant, but Strider took it as a sign that they could cross the bridge. At once, they went on again. They crossed the bridge in safety, hearing no sound but the water swirling against its 3 great arches. So at this moment, as the group crossed the last bridge, they're about 100 miles east of Weathertop. It's not clear who constructed the last bridge, but it's likely it was made by the Dunedain of Arnor, which was a huge kingdom of men in the Second Age, and whose kings were ancestors of Aragorn, or Strider, himself. It's also likely that they built a lot of the now ruined forts that can be seen in these lands. The last bridge would have been maintained and not allowed to fall into ruin because of its importance in crossing the river Mithathiel. The next nearest crossing of the river was hundreds of miles to the north. It's also likely that it was the point in The Hobbit where Thorin and his company lost a pony in the river Horwell, though the last bridge itself wasn't explicitly named. A mile further on, they came to a narrow ravine that led away northwards through the steep lands on the left of the road. Here Strider turned aside, and soon they were lost in a sombre country of dark trees winding among the feet of sullen hills. The hobbits were glad to leave the cheerless lands and the perilous road behind them, but this new country seemed threatening and unfriendly. As they went forward, the hills about them steadily rose. Here and there upon heights and ridges they caught glimpses of ancient walls of stone and the ruins of towers. They had an ominous look. The hills now began to shut them in. The road behind held on its way to the river Bruinen, but both were now hidden from view. The travellers came into a long valley, narrow, deeply cloven, dark and silent. Trees with old and twisted roots hung over cliffs and piled up behind into mounting slopes of pinewood. The hobbits grew very weary. They advanced slowly, for they had to pick their way through a pathless country, encumbered by fallen trees and tumbled rocks. As long as they could, they avoided climbing for Frodo's sake, and because it was in fact difficult to find any way up out of the narrow dales. They had been 2 days in this country when the weather turned wet. The wind began to blow steadily out of the west and pour the water of the distant seas on the dark heads of the hills in fine drenching rain. By nightfall they were all soaked. The next day the hills rose still higher and steeper before them, and they were forced to turn away northwards out of their course. Strider seemed to be getting anxious. They were nearly 10 days out from Weathertop, and their stock of provisions was beginning to run low. It went on raining. That night they camped on a stony shelf with a rock wall behind them, in which there was a shallow cave, a mere scoop in the cliff. The next morning the rain had stopped, and Strider went off alone after breakfast to climb up as high as he could to work out where they were and how they could get back on track. When he returned, he reported that they had gone too far north and were at risk of entering the troll country of the Ettindales, far north of Rivendell. The rest of that day they spent scrambling over rocky ground. They found a passage between 2 hills that led them into a valley running southeast, the direction that they wished to take, but towards the end of the day they found their road again barred by a ridge of high land. Its dark edge against the sky was broken into many bare points like teeth of a blunted saw. They had a choice between going back or climbing over it. They decided to attempt the climb, but it proved very difficult. Before long Frodo was obliged to dismount and struggle along on foot. Even so, they often despaired of getting their pony up, or indeed of finding a path for themselves, burdened as they were. The light was nearly gone, and they were all exhausted, when at last they reached the top. They had climbed onto a narrow saddle between 2 higher points, and the land fell steeply away again, only a short distance ahead. Frodo threw himself down and lay on the ground shivering. His left arm was lifeless, and his side and shoulder felt as if icy claws were laid upon them. The trees and rocks about him seemed shadowy and dim. Night was cold upon the high ridge. They lit a small fire down under the gnarled roots of an old pine that hung over a shallow pit. It looked as if stone had once been quarried there. They sat huddled together. The wind blew chill through the pass, and they heard the tree-tops lower down moaning and sighing. Frodo lay half in a dream, imagining that endless dark wings were sweeping by above him, and that on the wings rode pursuers that sought him in all the hollows of the hills. The morning dawned bright and fair. The air was clean, and the light pale and clear in a rain-washed sky. Their hearts were encouraged, but they longed for the sun to warm their cold, stiff limbs. As soon as it was light, Strider took Merry with him and went to survey the country from the height to the east of the pass. The sun had risen and was shining brightly when he returned with more comforting news. They were now going more or less in the right direction. As soon as they had eaten, they set out again. They climbed slowly down the southern side of the ridge, but the way was much easier than they had expected, for the slope was far less steep on this side, and before long Frodo was able to ride again. They then found the beginnings of a path that climbed with many windings out of the woods below and faded away on the hilltop behind. In places it was now faint and overgrown, or choked with fallen stones and trees, but at one time it seemed to have been much used. It was a path made by strong arms and heavy feet. Here and there old trees had been cut or broken down, and large rocks cloven or heaved aside to make a way. They followed the track for some while, for it offered much the easiest way down, but they went cautiously, and their anxiety increased as they came into the dark woods, and the path grew plainer and broader. Suddenly, coming out of a belt of fir trees, it ran steeply down a slope, and turned sharply to the left round the corner of a rocky shoulder of the hill. When they came to the corner, they looked round and saw that the path ran on over a level strip under the face of a low cliff overhung with trees. In the stony wall there was a door hanging crookedly ajar upon one great hinge. Outside the door they all halted. There was a cave or rock chamber behind, but in the gloom inside nothing could be seen. Strider, Sam and Merry, pushing with all their strength, managed to open the door a little wider, and then Strider and Merry went in. They did not go far, for on the floor lay many old bones, and nothing else was to be seen near the entrance, except some great empty jars and broken pots. The sun was now high, and it shone through the half-stripped branches of the trees, and lit the clearing with bright patches of light. They halted suddenly on the edge, and peered through the tree trunks, holding their breath. There stood the trolls, 3 large trolls. One was stooping, and the other 2 stood staring at him. Strider walked forward unconcernedly. "Get up, old stone," he said, and broke his stick upon the stooping troll. Nothing happened. There was a gasp of astonishment from the hobbits, and then even Frodo laughed. "Well," he said, "we're forgetting our family history. These must be the very 3 that were caught by Gandalf quarrelling over the right way to cook 13 dwarves and 1 hobbit." The group stayed here to eat their midday meal under the shadow of the troll's large legs, and Strider noted that one of the trolls even had a bird's nest behind his ear, which was an unusual ornament for a live troll. They left with higher spirits, and in time came back to the road. So as we head back to rejoin the road, here's a brief opportunity for a passage from The Hobbit. Here's the description of what Bilbo saw when he entered the glade 60 years ago. 3 very large persons sitting round a very large fire of beech logs. They were toasting mutton on long spits of wood and licking the gravy off their fingers. There was a fine, toothsome smell. Also, there was a barrel of good drink at hand, and they were drinking out of jugs. But they were trolls. Obviously trolls. Even Bilbo, in spite of his sheltered life, could see that. From the great heavy faces of them, and their size and the shape of their legs, not to mention their language, which was not drawing-room fashion at all. At all. "Mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey, if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow," said one of the trolls. "Never a blinking bit of man-flesh have we had for long enough," said a second. "What the hell William was a-thinking of to bring us to these parts that all beats me, and the drink running short what's more," he said, jogging the elbow of William, who was taking a pull at his jug. William choked. "Shut your mouth," he said as soon as he could. "You can't expect folk to stop here forever, just to be et by you and Bert. You've et a village and a half between you since we come down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way when you'd have said thank you, Bill, for a nice bit of fat valley mutton like what this is." He took a big bite off a sheep's leg he was roasting, and wiped his lips on his sleeve. Yes, I'm afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only 1 head each. As evening fell and they were looking for somewhere to rest for the night, they heard the sound of hooves drawing nearer. The rider was revealed to be Glorfindel, an elf sent by Elrond from Rivendell to find the party, and it was he who had placed the elf stone on the last bridge after warding the Black Riders away. Glorfindel studied Frodo's wound and seemed disquieted by what he learned. He then deemed that they carry on travelling through the night in order to get Frodo back to Rivendell. As dawn broke, they rested for 5 hours before Glorfindel urged them on once more. That night the hobbits were so exhausted they had a full night's rest before they at last headed down to the river Bruinen. The hobbits were still weary when they set off again early next morning. There were many miles to go between them and the ford, and they hobbled forward at the best pace they could manage. The road was running steadily downhill, and there was now in places much grass at either side, in which the hobbits walked when they could, to ease their tired feet. In the late afternoon they came to a place where the road ran suddenly under the dark shadow of tall pine trees, and then plunged into a deep cutting with steep, moist walls of red stone. Echoes ran along as they hurried forward, and there seemed to be a sound of many footfalls following their own. All at once, as if through a gate of light, the road ran out again from the end of the tunnel into the open. There at the bottom of a sharp incline, they saw before them a long flat mile, and beyond that the Ford of Rivendell. On the further side was a steep brown bank threaded by a winding path, and beyond that the tall mountains climbed shoulder above shoulder and peak beyond peak into the fading sky. There was still an echo as of following feet in the cutting behind them, a rushing noise as if a wind were rising and pouring through the branches of the pines. One moment Glorfindel turned and listened, then he sprang forward with a loud cry. "Fly!" he called. "Fly! The enemy is upon us!" The white horse leaped forward. The hobbits ran down the slope. Glorfindel and Strider followed as rearguard. They were only halfway across the flat when suddenly there was a noise of horses galloping. Out of the gate in the trees they had just left rode a black rider. He reined his horse in and halted, swaying in his saddle. Another followed him, and then another, and then again 2 more. Here Glorfindel called to his horse, on which Frodo was riding, to ride quickly the remaining distance to the ford, which it did, and being pursued by the Black Riders, it then crossed the ford with Frodo on his back. The Black Riders hesitated to follow Frodo across the river. Eventually, after mocking the hobbit, the Black Riders began to cross the ford. This is how Tolkien describes what happens next. At that moment there came a roaring and a rushing, a noise of loud waters rolling many stones. Dimly Frodo saw the river below him rise, and down along its course there came a plumed cavalry of waves. White flames seemed to Frodo to flicker on their crests, and he half fancied that he saw amid the waters white riders upon white horses with frothing manes. The 3 riders that were still in the midst of the ford were overwhelmed. They disappeared, buried suddenly under angry foam. Those that were behind drew back in dismay. Frodo then lost consciousness as the terrible damage done by the Morgul blade on Weathertop began to overcome him. And so here we end chapter 4 of Frodo's journey, with the Hobbit once again losing consciousness. In the next part we'll hopefully follow Frodo's progress to Rivendell, and we'll spend a bit of time there just like Frodo did, reacquainting with some old friends. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to my channel. It really helps to keep me motivated, especially in videos like this one, which have been particularly tricky to arrange. Until next time, thank you for watching.